It's just after 8 p.m. on October 14, 1912, outside the Hotel Gilpatrick in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Former President Theodore Roosevelt is leaving for his final campaign speech of the day, a 50-page address at the Milwaukee Auditorium. The 53-year-old Roosevelt, running as a third-party candidate on the progressive Bull Moose ticket, stands up in his open-air car to wave at the crowd of supporters gathered on the street. He has no idea that standing just 4 feet away is John Shrank, a delusional ex-saloon keeper from New York who believes William McKinley's ghost commanded him to murder Roosevelt. In the next few seconds, a single gunshot will ring out across the Milwaukee street. A .38 caliber bullet will slam into Roosevelt's chest, but rather than collapsing or seeking medical attention, the former Rough Rider will insist on delivering his scheduled speech, all 84 minutes of it, with a bullet lodged against his rib. Here is how it unfolded. By the time this video is published, over 110 years have passed since that October evening in Milwaukee, but Theodore Roosevelt's response to being shot remains one of the most remarkable displays of physical toughness and sheer stubborn determination in American political history. A moment when a former president literally took a bullet and kept campaigning. It's 1912, and Theodore Roosevelt is attempting something unprecedented in American politics, winning a third presidential term as a third-party candidate. Roosevelt served as president from 1901 to 1909, taking office after William McKinley's assassination, and then winning election in his own right in 1909 and 1904. He declined to run in 1908, throwing his support to his friend and successor, William Howard Taft. But by 1912, Roosevelt has grown disgusted with Taft's presidency, believing his former protege has betrayed progressive principles and allied himself with conservative Republican bosses. When Roosevelt attempts to win the Republican nomination, party leaders block him through procedural maneuvers at the convention. Outraged, Roosevelt bolts from the Republican Party and forms the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt declares he feels as strong as a bull moose. The 1912 campaign is one of the most dramatic in American history. The race features 4 candidates: Democrat Woodrow Wilson, Republican incumbent William Howard Taft, Progressive Theodore Roosevelt, and Socialist Eugene Debs. Roosevelt barnstorms across the country with his characteristic energy, delivering speech after speech attacking Taft as a tool of special interests and Wilson as too conservative. Roosevelt's campaign schedule in mid-October is punishing. He's travelling through multiple Midwestern states, giving numerous speeches per day, shaking thousands of hands, and maintaining the relentless pace that has defined his political career. On October 14th, he's in Milwaukee for 3 separate speaking engagements, with the final event scheduled for 8 p.m. at the Milwaukee Auditorium. Before leaving the Hotel Gilpatrick, Roosevelt carefully folds his 50-page speech and tucks it into the right breast pocket of his overcoat. The speech is printed on thick paper, and when folded in half, it creates a substantial wad of documents pressed against his chest. He also places his metal eyeglass case in the same pocket. Roosevelt is extremely nearsighted and keeps his glasses in a sturdy steel-reinforced case to protect them. Roosevelt emerges from the hotel wearing his customary overcoat, thick suspenders, and multiple layers of clothing suitable for a chilly October evening in Wisconsin. He's accompanied by his stenographer, Elbert Martin, a former football player, and his former Rough Rider comrade A.O. Girard. Campaign manager Henry Cochams is also present, along with Roosevelt's personal physician, Dr. Scurry Terrell, a throat specialist tasked with keeping Roosevelt's voice healthy during the grueling campaign. The scene outside the hotel is festive. Several hundred Roosevelt supporters crowd the street, cheering and waving as their candidate prepares to depart for the auditorium. Roosevelt, never one to miss an opportunity to connect with voters, stands up in the open-air car to wave and acknowledge the crowd. What Roosevelt doesn't notice is a short, stocky man with a wild-eyed expression pushing toward the front of the crowd. John Shrank is 36 years old, a Bavarian immigrant who came to America as a child and worked as a saloon keeper in New York City until selling his business several years earlier. Since then, he's drifted aimlessly, living on the proceeds from the sale and becoming increasingly unstable. Shrank has been stalking Roosevelt for weeks, following the campaign from city to city, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He's already attempted to get close enough to shoot Roosevelt in several other cities, but failed to find the right opportunity. Tonight in Milwaukee, With Roosevelt standing up in an open car surrounded by a relatively small crowd, Shrank finally has his chance. At approximately 8:10 p.m., as Roosevelt waves to the crowd, Shrank pulls out a .38 caliber Colt revolver and raises it toward the former president. Standing just 4 feet away, close enough to practically touch Roosevelt, Shrank fires a single shot directly at Roosevelt's chest. The gunshot cracks across the street, and Roosevelt staggers slightly, his knees buckling from the impact. The crowd screams in confusion and horror, not immediately understanding what has happened. But Roosevelt, incredibly, remains standing. He catches himself, steadies his posture, and continues tipping his hat to the crowd as if nothing has occurred. Henry Cockums, standing next to Roosevelt in the car, stares at his candidate in disbelief. "Colonel, are you hurt?" he asks urgently. Roosevelt reaches up to touch his chest, feeling the hole in his overcoat. "He pinked me, Harry," Roosevelt replies calmly, using an old-fashioned term meaning to wound or strike. Take a look at what happened in the seconds after the shot. Before Shrank can fire again, Elbert Martin and A.O. Girard launch themselves at the assassin. Martin, using his football training, goes low and tackles Shrank around the waist, while simultaneously grabbing for the gun. Girard seizes Shrank's arm, forcing the revolver upward so it can't be aimed at anyone. The two men wrestle Shrank to the ground as several Milwaukee police officers rush over to assist. Within seconds they have Shrank pinned, the gun wrestled from his grip. The crowd, realizing what has just happened, erupts in fury. Angry supporters surge forward, screaming for Shrank's blood, shouting, "Kill him! Lynch him!" But Roosevelt, still standing in the car with a bullet in his chest, raises his hand for silence. "Don't hurt him," he commands in a voice loud enough to carry over the mob. "Bring him here to me." The police drag the struggling Shrank toward Roosevelt's car. For a moment, the former president and his would-be assassin face each other. Roosevelt looks at Shrank coldly, examines the confiscated revolver, and makes a contemptuous observation. A .38 Colt has an ugly drive. Then he hands Shrank over to the police with clear instructions. "Officers, take charge of him and see that there is no harm done to him." Only after Shrank has been removed does Roosevelt allow his attention to return to his own condition. One of his secretaries points to the bullet hole in his overcoat. "Colonel, you're bleeding," he says urgently. "I know it," Roosevelt replies matter-of-factly. He opens his coat to reveal his shirt soaked with blood spreading from a hole in his chest. But Roosevelt is more concerned with assessing the severity of his injury than seeking immediate medical attention. He performs a self-diagnostic test that any modern doctor would consider insane. He coughs forcefully into his hand to check for blood. The logic is simple but sound. If the bullet has penetrated his lung, blood will appear in his cough. Roosevelt examines his hand carefully. It's dry, no blood. "The bullet didn't reach my lung," he announces with satisfaction. This crude field test convinces Roosevelt that while he's been shot, the wound isn't immediately life-threatening. Based on this assessment, Roosevelt makes a decision that astounds everyone around him. He will proceed to the auditorium and deliver his speech as scheduled. "I know I am good now," he tells his horrified staff. "I don't know how long I may be. This may be my last talk to our people, and while I am good, I am going to drive to the hall and deliver my speech." His campaign staff immediately protests. Henry Cockums pleads with Roosevelt to go to the hospital. Dr. Scurry Terrell insists that Roosevelt needs immediate medical attention. But Roosevelt is adamant. He's not going to disappoint the thousands of people waiting to hear him speak, and he's certainly not going to let an assassination attempt derail his campaign. Roosevelt takes a handkerchief, presses it against the bullet wound to slow the bleeding, buttons his vest and coat to hide the damage, and orders the driver to proceed to the auditorium. The ride through Milwaukee's streets takes about 10 minutes, with Roosevelt sitting grimly in the car, feeling his strength slowly ebbing as blood continues to seep from the wound. At the Milwaukee auditorium, news of the shooting has already spread through the crowd of 10,000 people packed inside. 2 additional doctors who are in attendance, presumably Roosevelt supporters, rush to examine him in a backstage room. They find Roosevelt with a bullet hole in his chest, still bleeding, his shirt soaked with blood. Both doctors strongly advise against giving the speech. The bullet could have damaged internal organs. Roosevelt could collapse on stage. The exertion of speaking could worsen his condition. But Roosevelt refuses to listen. He takes out his handkerchief, places it over the wound, buttons his shirt and vest carefully, and walks toward the stage. Henry Cockums delivers the introduction, his voice shaking as he prepares the audience for what they're about to witness. Ladies and gentlemen, I have something to tell you, and I hope you will receive it with calmness.
I will ask you to...
As he left his hotel, a dastardly hand aimed a revolver at the colonel, and he will speak to you, though there is a bullet somewhere in his breast. The crowd gasps in horror. Someone shouts, "Fake news!" Apparently, this phrase has a longer history than many realize, while others call out asking if Roosevelt is badly hurt. Roosevelt seizes this moment for a dramatic entrance, unbuttoning his vest to display his blood-soaked shirt to the shocked audience. "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible," Roosevelt says, his voice strong despite his injury. "I don't know whether you fully understand that I've been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The crowd erupts in applause and cheers, their initial horror transforming into admiration for their candidate's toughness. Roosevelt pulls out his 50-page speech, holding it up to show the audience the bullet hole that penetrates through all 50 pages. "Fortunately, I had my manuscript, so you see I was going to make a long speech," he says with grim humour. "There is a bullet. There is where the bullet went through, and it probably saved me from it going into my heart. The bullet is in me now, so I cannot make a very long speech, but I will try my best." This promise to keep the speech short is immediately broken. Roosevelt speaks for 84 minutes, an hour and 24 minutes, with a bullet lodged in his chest. He delivers his planned remarks attacking the conservative elements of both major parties, advocating for progressive reforms and arguing that the people deserve a voice in their government. As he speaks, Roosevelt drops each page of his speech to the stage floor after reading it, giving the front rows a clear view of the bullet holes punched through the documents. The 3 doctors present Terrell, and the 2 from the audience stand in the wings, ready to rush on stage if Roosevelt collapses. After 45 minutes, Roosevelt pauses to take a sip of water. "I'm going to ask you to be quiet as possible, for I'm not able to give the challenge of the bull moose quite as loudly," he admits, finally showing some acknowledgement of his condition. He promises just 50 more minutes, then continues speaking for another 39 minutes. Roosevelt's colour gradually drains from his face. He becomes short of breath, pausing frequently between sentences. His posture becomes more stooped as pain and blood loss take their toll. One concerned woman in the audience calls out, "Mr. Roosevelt, won't you sit down?" "I thank you, madam, but I don't mind a bit," Roosevelt replies with characteristic stubbornness, remaining standing for the entire speech. Finally, after 84 minutes, Roosevelt concludes his remarks. The audience gives him a thunderous standing ovation, many with tears streaming down their faces, having just witnessed one of the most extraordinary acts of physical courage in American political history. Only then does Roosevelt consent to seeking medical treatment. Roosevelt is rushed to Johnston Emergency Hospital in Milwaukee, where a team of physicians led by Dr. Joseph Colt Bloodgood, a name that sounds appropriately dramatic for treating a gunshot victim, examines him thoroughly. They discover a dime-sized hole in Roosevelt's chest, with the bullet lodged against his 4th rib, about 4 inches deep. The doctors are astounded that Roosevelt not only survived the shooting, but delivered an 84-minute speech immediately afterward. They clean and bandage the wound, then debate what to do about the bullet. X-rays reveal its position against the rib, too close to vital organs to risk surgical removal with 1912 technology. After extensive consultation, the medical team decides to leave the bullet in place. The risks of surgery infection, damage to the lung or heart, complications from anesthesia, outweigh the risk of letting the bullet remain. It's a souvenir Roosevelt will carry for the rest of his life. The factors that saved Roosevelt's life become clear during the examination. The thick folded speech in his breast pocket, doubled over to 50 pages, slowed the bullet significantly. The steel-reinforced eyeglass case deflected and further slowed the projectile. His heavy overcoat, vest, suspenders and shirt provided additional layers of resistance. By the time the bullet reached Roosevelt's body, it had lost much of its lethal velocity. If Shrank had fired at an unprotected part of Roosevelt's body, or if Roosevelt hadn't been carrying his speech and glasses case, the .38 caliber bullet fired from 4 feet away would almost certainly have killed him. The combination of factors that saved his life represents an extraordinary stroke of luck. Take a look at what happened to John Shrank after his arrest. When police search him, they find a rambling letter explaining his motive for the assassination attempt. The document reveals a man completely detached from reality, driven by what he believes is a divine mission. Shrank's delusion centers on a dream he claims to have had weeks earlier. In this dream, the ghost of President William McKinley, assassinated in 1901 by anarchist Leon Czolgosz, sat up in his coffin, pointed at Theodore Roosevelt and declared, "This is my murderer. Avenge my death." Shrank took this dream literally. He convinced himself that Roosevelt had somehow orchestrated McKinley's assassination to seize the presidency, despite there being absolutely no evidence for such a conspiracy and overwhelming evidence that Roosevelt had nothing to do with McKinley's death. But in Shrank's deteriorating mind, the dream was a message from beyond the grave, a divine command that he must obey. Armed with this delusion, Shrank travelled from New York to Wisconsin, following Roosevelt's campaign trail and waiting for his opportunity. He carried his .38 Colt revolver and his rambling manifesto, prepared to become what he saw as an instrument of justice avenging a murdered president. After his arrest, Shrank is examined by psychiatrists, who quickly determine he's suffering from paranoid delusions and is legally insane. He's found unfit to stand trial and committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupunn, Wisconsin. Shrank will remain institutionalized for the rest of his life, dying in the hospital in 1943 at age 67, having spent 31 years locked away for his failed assassination attempt. The political impact of the assassination attempt is significant, but ultimately doesn't change the outcome of the 1912 election. Roosevelt's heroic response to being shot generates tremendous publicity and sympathy, but it can't overcome the fundamental problem facing his campaign. By running as a third-party candidate, he's splitting the Republican vote with William Howard Taft. The mathematics are brutal. Roosevelt and Taft together receive more votes than Democrat Woodrow Wilson, but separately neither can win. Wilson captures the presidency with just 41.8% of the popular vote, the lowest winning percentage since Abraham Lincoln in 1860, because the Republican vote is divided between Taft and Roosevelt. Roosevelt finishes second with 27.4% of the vote, an impressive showing for a third-party candidate and the best third-party performance in American history. Taft finishes third with 23.2%, the worst showing ever for an incumbent president seeking re-election. Socialist Eugene Debs receives 6%, the highest vote total for a socialist candidate in American history. The progressive Bull Moose Party briefly appears to have a future after Roosevelt's strong showing, but it collapses after 1912 without Roosevelt at its head. Most progressives return to the Republican Party, while others join the Democrats, leaving the Bull Moose as a footnote in political history, though a dramatic and influential footnote that pushed both major parties in a more progressive direction. Roosevelt returns to private life after his defeat, though he remains active in public affairs. He leads an expedition to South America in 1913 to 1914 to explore an uncharted tributary of the Amazon River, a journey that nearly kills him from disease and injury, but results in the river being renamed Rio Roosevelt in his honor. When World War I begins in 1914, Roosevelt becomes an outspoken advocate for American intervention on the side of Britain and France. After America enters the war in 1917, Roosevelt desperately wants to lead troops in combat despite being 58 years old and in declining health. President Wilson denies his request, keeping the former president at home. Roosevelt's health deteriorates in his final years. The injuries from his Brazilian expedition, combined with the long-term effects of various ailments and injuries accumulated over a lifetime of strenuous activity, take their toll. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt dies in his sleep at his home in Sagamore Hill, New York. He's 60 years old. Even in death, Theodore Roosevelt's presence refused to fade. News of his passing rippled across the nation like a shockwave, stirring sorrow, admiration, and reflection. Newspapers ran headlines that framed him not merely as a former president, but as a force of nature, a man who had lived with intensity, fought with courage, and demanded more from his country and its people than most could imagine giving. Citizens of all ages and walks of life paused, recalling the stories that had defined him, the charge up San Juan Hill, the relentless political campaigns, the Amazon expedition, and above all the night in Milwaukee when a bullet failed to silence him. Roosevelt had been larger than life, and in his absence, that life became legend. Scholars and journalists debated his legacy endlessly. Some praised his vision, his progressive reforms, and his indomitable will. Others criticized his arrogance, his recklessness, his stubborn insistence on testing the limits of his own strength. Yet all agreed on one undeniable truth. Theodore Roosevelt had lived on his own terms. He had refused compromise when compromise would have betrayed principle, He had refused fear when fear could have protected him, and he had refused to let death dictate the terms of his final acts. For generations, his story became a lesson in resilience. The image of the bull moose, bloodied yet standing tall on that stage in Milwaukee, became a symbol far beyond politics. It was a story parents told children, a story soldiers remembered before going into battle, a story leaders revisited when courage seemed impossible. The bullet lodged against his rib was never removed, a tangible reminder that life is never without scars, but that scars can become emblems of survival, of defiance, of purpose. Roosevelt's influence persisted in subtle ways. Progressive reforms he championed, trust-busting, labor protections, conservation efforts, became cornerstones of American governance. His writings on courage, duty, and leadership were studied not only for their practical insight, but for the almost spiritual fire they contained. In his speeches, in his books, in the stories people passed down, Roosevelt remained a presence, a benchmark for what it meant to live fully, without hesitation and without apology. Even the bullet forever lodged in his chest became symbolic. It represented the convergence of chance, fate, and human will, the fragile boundary between life and death, and the extraordinary human capacity to meet adversity with strength, humor, and dignity. Roosevelt had been struck, wounded, tested, and in every instance, he had risen, stronger and more resolute. As the years stretched on, Theodore Roosevelt transcended memory. He became myth, legend, a standard of courage against which all subsequent generations measured themselves. His life was a narrative of action, over fear, of principle, over comfort, of relentless devotion to what one believes is right. Death had claimed his body, but the spirit of the bull moose, the rough rider, the man who had stared down bullets and dared the world to stop him, lived on forever.